London, 1845. The season had begun with unusual splendor, the ballrooms of Mayfair gleaming with crystal chandeliers that cast dancing shadows upon silk gowns and polished marble floors. Yet far from the glittering heart of the city, in the windswept moorlands of Derbyshire, Amelia Davenport knew nothing of such magnificence. She had never attended a ball, never curtsied before the Queen, never felt the weight of a dance card dangling from her wrist. Her world was composed of grey stone walls, endless fields of heather, and the persistent whisper of secrets that had shaped her entire existence. She was 17 years old that autumn, standing at the window of Thornfield Manor as rain battered the glass with relentless fury. The manor itself was modest by aristocratic standards, a fortress of solitude purchased years ago by her father, the Earl of Pemberton, for the express purpose of hiding his greatest shame. Amelia understood this with the clarity that comes from years of careful observation and overheard conversations. She was the product of passion and indiscretion, born to Catherine Davenport, who had once been governess to the Earl's legitimate children before becoming his mistress. Her mother moved through the manor with the practiced silence of someone who had learned to make herself small. Catherine was 40 now, her beauty faded but not entirely gone, lingering in the elegant line of her neck and the intelligent spark in her grey eyes. She had taught Amelia everything: French, Italian, literature, music, the arts of needlework and watercolor painting. But she had also taught her daughter the most important lesson of all, that love, when it crossed the boundaries of class and propriety, brought nothing but heartbreak. Amelia had inherited her mother's fine features and her father's dark hair, which fell in waves past her shoulders when she loosened it from its customary braid. Her eyes were an unusual shade of amber, flecked with gold, and her skin held a warmth that spoke of vitality despite her cloistered existence. She read voraciously, devouring every book that arrived in the quarterly shipments from London, and she wrote in journals that she kept hidden beneath the floorboards of her room. In those pages she recorded not just her daily life, but her dreams, wild, impossible dreams of a world beyond the moors, of ballrooms and laughter, of being seen and acknowledged rather than hidden away like a shameful secret. The Earl visited once a year, always in autumn when the London season had ended, and his legitimate family had retired to their country estate in Kent. He arrived in an unmarked carriage, spent precisely 3 days at Thornfield, and departed with the same discretion. During these visits, he would sit with Amelia in the drawing-room, asking about her studies and her health with the distant politeness one might show a ward or a distant relation. He never called her daughter. He never embraced her. But he ensured that she and Catherine wanted for nothing materially, and Amelia supposed that was a form of love, however cold and carefully rationed. The servants at Thornfield were few: Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, Mr. Graves, who managed the grounds, and 2 maids, Sarah and Ellen, who had been with them for years. They were loyal and discreet, paid handsomely for their silence. The nearest village was 5 miles away, and Amelia ventured there only occasionally, always in Catherine's company, always careful to maintain the fiction that they were merely a widow and her daughter living quietly in retirement. It was during one such visit to the village, in late September of that year, that Amelia's carefully ordered world began its inexorable transformation. The market square of Ashford was bustling with farmers and merchants, the air rich with the scent of fresh bread and autumn apples. Catherine had stopped to examine bolts of fabric, while Amelia wandered toward a bookseller's stall, her attention caught by a volume of Lord Byron's poetry. She was reaching for it when another hand appeared, masculine and elegant, fingers brushing against hers. She looked up and found herself staring into eyes of such intense blue that for a moment she forgot to breathe. The man was tall, perhaps 10 years her senior, with dark hair swept back from a face that could have been carved by a master sculptor. He wore clothes of obvious quality, a coat of deep charcoal wool, a waistcoat embroidered with silver thread, boots polished to a mirror shine. But it was not his appearance that arrested her attention. It was the way he looked at her, as though she were the only person in the entire market square, as though she mattered. "I beg your pardon," he said, his voice cultured and warm. "It seems we have similar taste in literature. Amelia withdrew her hand quickly, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "I was merely browsing, sir. Please take it." He smiled, and the expression transformed his face from merely handsome to something approaching devastating. "I would not dream of depriving you. Allow me." He purchased the book and held it out to her, a gift from one admirer of Byron to another. She should have refused. Every lesson her mother had taught her about propriety and caution screamed that she should thank him politely and walk away. But something in his gaze held her transfixed, something that made her feel suddenly brilliantly alive. "I cannot accept gifts from strangers, sir." "Then we should remedy the stranger part at least." Edward Blackthorne. He did not offer his title, she noticed, though there was something in his bearing that spoke of rank and privilege. "Amelia," she said, then caught herself. "Miss Davenport." "Miss Davenport." He repeated her name as though testing its flavor. "Are you from Ashford?" "Nearby, Thornfield Manor." The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. Her mother appeared at her elbow, grey eyes sharp with alarm. "Amelia, we must go. The carriage is waiting." Catherine's voice was steady, but Amelia could read the tension in the set of her shoulders. Edward Blackthorne's gaze shifted to Catherine, and he bowed with perfect courtesy. "Madam, I hope I have not caused any offence." "None at all, sir. Good day." Catherine took Amelia's arm and steered her away with gentle but insistent pressure. The book remained in Edward's hands, and Amelia looked back only once to find him still watching her, an expression of puzzlement and fascination on his aristocratic features. In the carriage, Catherine was silent for a long moment before speaking. That was the Duke of Ravenshire. Amelia's breath caught. She had heard of the Blackthorne family, of course. Everyone had. The Duke of Ravenshire was one of the most powerful men in England, his wealth exceeded only by his reputation. The previous Duke, Edward's father, had died in a scandal involving a French actress and a duel that left 2 men dead. Edward had inherited the title at 23 and had spent the intervening years rebuilding the family name through careful diplomacy and shrewd investments. "You must have no further contact with him," Catherine said, her voice tight with fear. "Men like that, men of his rank, they do not form proper attachments to girls like you. Whatever you are thinking, whatever you felt when he looked at you, put it from your mind." But it was already too late. That night, lying in her narrow bed as wind howled across the moors, Amelia could think of nothing but blue eyes and a voice that had made her name sound like music. She told herself that she would never see him again, that their meeting had been chance and nothing more. She was wrong. 3 days later, a package arrived at Thornfield Manor. Inside was the Byron volume wrapped in fine paper and accompanied by a note written in elegant script. "I could not bear to keep what was meant for you. A proper introduction would be my honor, should you ever find yourself in London. Yours in admiration, Edward Blackthorne, Duke of Ravenshire." Catherine found Amelia with the book clutched to her chest and tears streaming down her face. She said nothing, but the look of profound sadness in her eyes spoke volumes. She knew, as Amelia was beginning to understand, that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. The weeks that followed were torture of the sweetest kind. Amelia read the Byron volume until she could recite passages from memory, and each word seemed imbued with meaning, as though Edward had chosen this particular edition specifically for her. She found herself watching the road from her window, hoping against hope for a carriage that never came. Autumn deepened into winter, and the moors grew harsh and unforgiving, blanketed with snow that turned the world into a study in white and grey. Then, on a December morning when frost etched patterns on the windows, Mr. Graves appeared at the drawing-room door with unusual colour in his weathered cheeks. "There's a gentleman caller, madam, the Duke of Ravenshire. He asks permission to pay his respects." Catherine went pale. Amelia felt her heart hammer against her ribs. They exchanged a long look, and in that moment, 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. Catherine had tried to protect her daughter from precisely this situation, but fate had proven stronger than caution. "Show him in," Catherine said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward Blackthorne entered the drawing-room like winter sunlight, bringing with him an energy that seemed to dispel the gloom that had settled over Thornfield. He bowed to Catherine with perfect propriety before turning to Amelia. Miss Davenport, I hope you will forgive the presumption of my visit. I found myself travelling through Derbyshire and could not resist the opportunity to ensure that the Byron found its proper home. His words were carefully chosen, giving Catherine no cause for immediate offence, but his eyes told a different story. He looked at Amelia with hunger barely contained, with a longing that matched her own. She tried to speak, and found her voice had abandoned her entirely. Catherine, ever practical, assumed her role as chaperone with rigid propriety. She insisted that they take tea in the formal sitting room with the door left open, that conversation remain on topics of literature and current affairs, that no impropriety be allowed. Edward complied with every requirement, but as the afternoon wore on, Amelia felt the air between them crackle with unspoken desire. He spoke of his travels, of his estates in Northumberland and Cornwall, of the responsibilities that came with his title. He asked about her reading, her interests, her views on poetry and philosophy. They discovered shared passions, a love of Shakespeare, a fascination with the Gothic novels that were so popular, a preference for the wild beauty of the countryside over the manicured perfection of London's parks. Hours passed like minutes, and when Edward finally rose to take his leave, Amelia felt as though something vital was being torn from her chest. At the door, he turned to Catherine. "Madam, I wonder if I might impose upon your hospitality. I find myself in need of accommodations in the area, and the inn at Ashford leaves much to be desired. Might Thornfield have a room to spare for a night or two?" It was audacious, improper, and Catherine should have refused immediately. But something in Edward's expression, a sincerity beneath the aristocratic polish, a vulnerability that seemed at odds with his rank, made her hesitate. Or perhaps it was the look on Amelia's face, the desperate hope that her daughter could not quite hide. "We have a guest room," Catherine said slowly, "but I must insist upon proper behaviour, Your Grace. My daughter's reputation, limited though it may be, is precious to me." "You have my word as a gentleman," Edward replied, and the gravity in his voice suggested he understood the full weight of what he was asking. That evening, as snow began to fall in earnest, the three of them dined together in Thornfield's modest dining room. Edward charmed Catherine with his wit and intelligence, discussing topics that revealed a mind far more sophisticated than his youth would suggest. He asked Catherine about her own history with genuine interest, and though she shared little, Amelia could see her mother's defences slowly crumbling. After dinner, Edward asked if he might see Amelia's watercolours, which Catherine had mentioned. They went to the small conservatory at the back of the manor, where Amelia kept her easel and paints. The rooms smelled of earth and growing things, for Catherine maintained a modest collection of herbs and flowers even in winter. A fire burned in the small hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Edward studied her paintings with the attention of someone who truly saw them. She had painted the moors in all their moods, stormy and tranquil, summer gold and winter stark. She had painted the sky at dawn and dusk, the play of light on water, the ancient stones that dotted the landscape like sentinels from another age. "You see beauty where others see only desolation," he said quietly. "That is a rare gift." "It is all I have known," Amelia replied. "This place, these walls. Sometimes I wonder what I would paint if I saw more of the world." He turned to face her, and suddenly the space between them felt charged with possibility. "I could show you the world, Amelia, if you would allow it." She should have demurred, should have remembered her place and his, should have recalled every warning her mother had ever given. Instead, she found herself stepping closer. "Why did you come here, truly?" "Because from the moment I saw you in that market square, I have been unable to think of anything else. Because your face haunts my dreams, and your name is the first word I speak when I wake. Because I am 27 years old, and until I met you, I had begun to believe that love was something that happened to other people, not to men burdened with titles and expectations." His hand rose to cup her cheek, the touch so gentle it made her ache. "Because I am falling in love with you, Amelia Davenport, and I find I have no desire to stop." The kiss, when it came, was inevitable as sunrise. His lips met hers with a tenderness that made her knees weak, and she found herself clinging to his shoulders as the world tilted on its axis. She had never been kissed before. had never felt the rush of sensation that flooded through her body like liquid fire. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she saw her own wonder reflected in his eyes. "This is madness," she whispered. "The very best kind," he replied, and kissed her again. They were discovered by Catherine 10 minutes later. She stood in the doorway, lamplight casting her shadow long across the floor, and the expression on her face was one of such profound despair that Amelia felt shame wash over her in cold waves. Edward stepped away immediately, bowing to Catherine with genuine contrition. "Mrs. Davenport, I owe you an apology. I have been ungentlemanly and have abused your hospitality." "You should leave," Catherine said, her voice trembling. "At first light, Your Grace, and you should not return." "Mamma, please," Amelia began, but Catherine cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Do you understand what you are risking? What this could cost you?" Catherine's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "He is a duke, Amelia. He will marry a woman chosen for him by his family, someone of appropriate rank and fortune. And you will be left with nothing but memories and a ruined reputation." "I would never allow harm to come to her," Edward said, his voice steady. "I give you my word." "The word of a man means little when weighed against the expectations of an entire class," Catherine replied bitterly. "I know this better than most, Your Grace. I lived it. I will not watch my daughter walk the same path." Edward left the next morning, but not before slipping a letter under Amelia's door. In it, he poured out his heart in words that made her weep. Declarations of love, promises of constancy, plans for a future that seemed impossible. He gave her an address in London, where letters could be sent discreetly, and he begged her not to give up hope. Against Catherine's wishes, against every dictate of common sense, Amelia began to write to him. Her letters were sent through a circuitous route, passed through servants loyal to Edward and a bookseller in Ashford who asked no questions. Edward's responses came with the same frequency, each one more passionate than the last. He told her about his life in London, about the tedium of parliamentary sessions and the emptiness of society balls where every eligible young woman seemed interchangeable. He described his estates and the improvements he was making, and he spoke of a future where she might walk those grounds as his duchess. Winter gave way to spring, and their correspondence intensified. They wrote of philosophy and poetry, of their hopes and fears, of the physical longing that kept them both awake at night. Edward sent her books and sheet music, small gifts that Catherine did not intercept because they came disguised as shipments from London merchants. And through it all, Amelia felt herself changing, growing bolder and more certain of what she wanted. In May, Edward managed a second visit to Thornfield, this time under the pretense of inspecting properties in the area for potential investment. Catherine's resistance had weakened, worn down by Amelia's obvious misery and perhaps by her own memories of a love that had been genuine, even if it was forbidden. She allowed Edward to take Amelia on walks across the moors, always with a maid in attendance at a discreet distance, and she pretended not to notice when they found moments of privacy behind ancient standing stones or in the shelter of windswept valleys. During these stolen moments, Edward and Amelia spoke of the future with increasing urgency. He had begun to plan, he told her, had started laying groundwork with his solicitors to ensure that when he announced his intention to marry her, it would be done in a way that could not be easily contested. His family would object strenuously. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, was a formidable woman with rigid views on propriety, and his younger sister Beatrice was set to make her debut in society and would be scandalized by any hint of impropriety. But Edward was determined. "I will speak to my family after the summer," he promised, holding both her hands as they stood on a hilltop overlooking the endless expanse of moorland. "I will make them understand that you are not a choice but a necessity, that without you I am only half alive." Amelia wanted to believe him. She let herself imagine a life in London, presiding over balls and dinner parties, taking Edward's arm as they strolled through Hyde Park, being presented at court. It seemed like a fairy tale, too beautiful to be real, but Edward's conviction was infectious. Then autumn came, and with it disaster. The Earl of Pemberton arrived at Thornfield for his annual visit and discovered the correspondence hidden in Amelia's room. Catherine had suspected nothing, and Amelia had grown careless in her happiness. The Earl's rage was terrifying in its coldness. He did not shout or strike her. but the disappointment in his eyes cut deeper than any blow. "I have given you everything," he said, his voice like ice. "A home, an education, a comfortable existence far from the censure of society. And this is how you repay me? By forming an attachment with a man who will bring nothing but scandal to both our families?" "He loves me," Amelia said desperately. "He intends to marry me." The Earl laughed, a sound devoid of humour. "Marry you? My dear girl, the Duke of Ravenshire has been in negotiations with the Duke of Somerset for months. He is betrothed to Lady Caroline Ashford, the daughter of one of the most powerful families in England. The announcement will be made before Christmas." The world seemed to tilt beneath Amelia's feet. "You are lying." "I wish I were. I received the news from Somerset himself just last week at my club. The match has been in the works for over a year, carefully arranged to unite two great families. Whatever pretty words Ravenshire has spoken to you, whatever promises he has made, they are meaningless. He will marry Lady Caroline, and you will be forgotten." Catherine, who had been standing silent in the corner, made a sound like a wounded animal. The Earl turned to her with something approaching pity. "I warned you, Catherine. I told you that nothing good could come of allowing her to indulge these fantasies. Now it must end." He arranged for Amelia to be sent away that very week, to a remote estate in Scotland owned by a distant cousin. Catherine begged to accompany her, but the Earl refused. Amelia would go with only a lady's maid for company, and she would remain there until the scandal had died, and she had come to her senses. Amelia managed to send one final letter to Edward before she left, pouring out her heartbreak and begging him to tell her the truth. Had he known about Lady Caroline? Had their entire courtship been nothing but an amusement to pass the time? The reply came 3 days after she arrived in Scotland, forwarded through their usual channels. Edward's handwriting was wild, desperate. He swore he had known nothing of any betrothal, that his mother and her solicitors had been working behind his back. He had confronted his family and been told in no uncertain terms that the arrangement with the Duke of Somerset was binding, that breaking it would result in social ruin for the Blackthorn name. But he refused to give up. He would find a way, he promised. He would not marry Lady Caroline. He would come for Amelia if it was the last thing he did. But weeks passed with no further word. November arrived, cold and brutal in the Scottish Highlands. Amelia spent her days staring out at grey mountains and trying not to imagine Edward standing at the altar with another woman. The isolation was crushing, and the maid who had accompanied her was under strict orders not to allow any visitors or correspondence. Then, on a morning when frost had turned the windows to sheets of ice, a commotion in the courtyard drew Amelia to her chamber window. A rider was dismounting from a lathered horse, moving with the stiff urgency of someone who had ridden through the night. Even from a distance, she recognized the set of his shoulders, the way he moved. Edward. She ran down the stairs, propriety forgotten, and burst into the entrance hall just as he was arguing with the estate's housekeeper. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and the look on his face made her heart clench. He looked haggard, older, as though the weeks apart had cost him years. Amelia. Her name on his lips was a prayer and a curse. "You came," she whispered. "I will always come." He closed the distance between them in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms with a desperation that took her breath away. "I am so sorry, for my family's machinations, for the pain I have caused you, for not being strong enough to defy them sooner." "What about Lady Caroline?" "There is no betrothal. There never was, not truly. My mother had been in discussions with Somerset, but no formal agreement was made. When I confronted them, when I made it clear that I would never marry anyone but you, they tried to force my hand. They threatened to cut me off, to ruin your family's name, to make both our lives impossible." He pulled back enough to cup her face in his hands. "But I do not care. I am the Duke of Ravenshire, and I will marry whom I choose. Even if it means defying every convention, every expectation, even if the whole of society turns against us." "They will never accept me," Amelia said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I am illegitimate, penniless, nobody." "You are everything," Edward replied fiercely. "You are the woman I love, the only woman I will ever love, and I will spend the rest of my life proving to the world that you are worthy of your place at my side." He kissed her then with all the pent-up longing of their separation, and Amelia felt something fundamental shift inside her. This was not the girlish infatuation she had once feared it might be. This was real, solid, unshakable. Whatever storms came, they would face them together. But the world, as it turned out, had other plans. Edward returned to London to begin the formal process of announcing their engagement, and Amelia waited in Scotland for word that it was safe to join him. The letter that arrived 2 weeks later was not from Edward, but from Catherine. "My dearest daughter," it read, "I write to you with the heaviest of hearts. The Duke of Ravenshire announced his intention to marry you before his family and a selection of society's most prominent members. The reaction was worse than we feared. His mother has disowned him publicly. His sister has been withdrawn from society, her debut ruined by association with the scandal. And this morning I received word that the Earl has cut off all financial support to Thornfield. We are to vacate the premises by year's end. I tell you this not to burden you, but because you must understand the cost of this love. Edward Blackthorne is willing to sacrifice everything for you. Are you prepared to let him?" Amelia read the letter 3 times before its full meaning penetrated. Everyone Edward loved, everything he had worked for, was being destroyed because of her. His family was fractured, his sister's future jeopardized, and now even her mother was suffering consequences. The weight of it was crushing. That night, she made the hardest decision of her life. She wrote to Edward, telling him that she could not marry him, that the cost was too high, that she released him from all promises and begged him to rebuild his life without her. She told him that she loved him too much to watch him lose everything, and that sometimes the greatest act of love was letting go. Then she gave the letter to the estate steward with instructions to deliver it personally to the Duke of Ravenshire. The weeks that followed were a blur of grief. Amelia existed in a fog, moving through each day mechanically. Catherine wrote that she had found modest lodgings in Bath, and Amelia made plans to join her there. They would live quietly, 2 women alone, and perhaps in time the pain would fade to a bearable ache. But Edward Blackthorne, it seemed, was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. On a December afternoon, when snow was beginning to fall and Amelia was packing her few belongings for the journey to Bath, he appeared once more. This time, he came not as a supplicant, but as a man who had made his choice and would not be swayed. "You will not push me away," he said, striding into the drawing room where she sat frozen in shock. "You will not sacrifice yourself on the altar of propriety. I have spent the last month setting my affairs in order, and I have come to take you home." "Edward, please, my family will learn to accept reality. My mother is proud and stubborn, but she is not stupid. She knows that I am lost without you, and eventually maternal instinct will overcome social prejudice. As for Beatrice, she is young and resilient. She will have her debut next season, and any scandal will have faded by then. I have ensured her dowry is protected, and I have arranged for her to spend the season with our aunt in Cornwall, away from the gossip of London. And the Earl has no power over you anymore. You are of age, Amelia. He cannot prevent our marriage, and as for Thornfield and your mother, I have purchased the property. It will remain yours, a wedding gift, should Catherine choose to return to it, or should you wish to keep it as a retreat from London." Amelia felt her careful resolve crumbling. "Why are you doing this? Why sacrifice so much?" Edward knelt before her, taking both her hands in his. "Because a life without you is not a life at all. Because in the 27 years before I met you, I was merely existing, going through the motions expected of me. You woke something in me that I did not know was sleeping. Joy, passion, purpose. I have wealth and title and power, but none of it matters without someone to share it with. Without you." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Marry me, Amelia. Not because it is easy or because society approves, but because it is right, because we belong to each other." She looked into his eyes and saw her own future reflected there. Difficult, certainly, filled with challenges and perhaps always touched by scandal. But also filled with love, with partnership, with a man who had proven himself willing to sacrifice everything for her happiness. How could she be the one to walk away? "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." They were wed 3 days later in a small chapel in Edinburgh, with only Catherine and the local vicar as witnesses. Edward placed a ring on her finger, a sapphire the color of his eyes, surrounded by diamonds that caught the winter light like captured stars. And when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, when Edward kissed her as snow fell past the chapel windows, Amelia felt the last chains of her old life fall away. The journey back to London was long and cold, but Amelia barely noticed. She sat beside Edward in his carriage, his arm around her shoulders, and listened as he described Ravenshire House, the London townhouse where they would live. It was enormous, he warned her, filled with rooms that had not been opened in years. His father had neglected it in favor of his various pursuits, and Edward had been so focused on rebuilding the family fortune that he had paid little attention to the house itself. It would be hers to transform, he said, to make into a home rather than just a monument to past glory. They arrived in London on a grey January afternoon, the city shrouded in fog. Ravenshire House loomed before them, a Georgian mansion of cream-coloured stone, with windows that seemed to watch their approach. The staff was lined up to greet them, and Amelia could read surprise and speculation on every face. She was not what they had expected, clearly, not a lady of breeding and fortune, but a girl in a simple travelling dress with no jewels or elaborate coiffure. But Edward introduced her with pride, his hand firm at the small of her back. "May I present Her Grace, Amelia Blackthorne, Duchess of Ravenshire." And the staff, well-trained and loyal, bowed and curtsied with perfect deference, whatever their private thoughts might be. The first weeks in London were a trial by fire. Edward insisted on presenting Amelia to society immediately, refusing to hide their marriage or treat it as anything less than a love match to be celebrated. They attended a ball at the home of the Marquis of Grantham, and Amelia felt every eye in the room fix upon her the moment they entered. The whispers were immediate and cruel. She heard snippets as she passed: illegitimate daughter, Earl's byblow, governess for a mother, social climber. The ladies of the Tarn examined her with cold eyes, taking in every detail of her appearance and finding it wanting. She was pretty enough, they seemed to conclude, but entirely unsuitable for a duke. Edward was magnificent in her defence. He refused to leave her side, introducing her to every important personage with unwavering courtesy. When Lady Pemberton, a notorious gossip, made a comment about the unusual circumstances of their marriage, Edward replied with icy civility, "I consider myself the most fortunate of men, Lady Pemberton. Not every gentleman is lucky enough to marry for love." But the isolation was profound. Invitations stopped coming. Ladies who had previously courted Edward's favour now cut him in the street. At the theatre they were subjected to stares and murmurs. Amelia tried to bear it with grace, but there were nights when she wept in Edward's arms, convinced that she had ruined his life. "Let them gossip," Edward would say, stroking her hair. "Their opinions mean nothing. In time they will see what I see, a woman of intelligence, kindness and strength. And if they never see it, then they are not worth knowing." Slowly, incrementally, things began to change. Edward's aunt, Lady Hertford, a woman of impeccable reputation and considerable influence, paid a call on Amelia and pronounced her perfectly charming. The Earl of Somerset, whose daughter had supposedly been jilted, sent a cordial note congratulating them on their marriage, and noting that Lady Caroline had become engaged to a viscount and was quite content. A few younger members of society, those less bound by rigid convention, began to seek Amelia's company, finding her conversation more engaging than the usual insipid chatter of ballrooms. And then there was the incident at the Duchess of Marlborough's ball, an event that became legendary in society circles and marked the true turning point in Amelia's acceptance. The Duchess, a formidable matron in her 60s, had been one of the most vocal opponents of Edward's marriage. She had made no secret of her disapproval and had pointedly failed to invite the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshire to any of her events. But in April, she hosted a ball to celebrate her granddaughter's engagement, and Edward received an invitation. It was clearly a peace offering, and Edward insisted that they attend. Amelia, dressed with care in a gown of midnight blue silk, her only jewellery the sapphire ring Edward had given her, and a pair of diamond earrings that had belonged to his grandmother. The ball was magnificent. the Marlborough house blazing with light and music. But the atmosphere chilled perceptibly when Edward and Amelia were announced. Conversation stuttered and died as they descended the stairs into the ballroom. The Duchess of Marlborough stood at the far end of the room, a tiny woman in purple silk watching their approach with hooded eyes. Edward led Amelia directly to her. They bowed and curtsied, and for a long moment the Duchess said nothing. Then, to everyone's shock, she extended her hand to Amelia. "So you are the woman who has caused such a stir in our little world," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom. "I confess I had expected someone quite different, someone grasping and vulgar perhaps, or simpering and weak, but I see neither of those qualities in you, child." "Your Grace is most kind," Amelia replied, keeping her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I am not kind. I am curious. Tell me, what does a young woman feel when she has won the heart of one of England's most eligible bachelors, but in doing so has made herself an outcast?" It was a test, Amelia realized, and the entire room was watching to see how she would respond. She could feel Edward tense beside her, ready to defend her, but she laid a gentle hand on his arm. "I feel," she said clearly, "that I am exactly where I belong. I did not seek a title or a fortune, Your Grace. I sought only to be true to my heart, and in doing so I found a partner who values me not for my lineage, but for who I am. If that makes me an outcast, then I accept it gladly, for I would rather live honestly in society's shadow than falsely in its light." The silence that followed was absolute. The Duchess of Marlborough studied Amelia for what felt like an eternity, her pale eyes sharp and assessing. Then, incredibly, she smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her austere features. "Well said, child. Well said indeed." She turned to address the room at large, her voice ringing with authority. "I have lived 73 years and seen countless marriages of convenience, unions built on land and lineage that crumbled under the weight of indifference. Yet here stands a duke who chose love over duty, and a woman who possesses the courage to stand beside him despite our collective disdain. Perhaps we are the fools, not they." The Duchess took Amelia's hand and placed it in the crook of her arm, a gesture of acceptance so public and unmistakable that a murmur rippled through the ballroom. "Come, my dear, let me introduce you properly to society. It is past time we acknowledge that the rules we cling to so desperately are sometimes in need of revision." From that moment, the tide began to turn in earnest. If the formidable Duchess of Marlborough accepted the new Duchess of Ravenshire, then others would follow. It was still a gradual process. Some doors remained closed, some ladies still cut her in the street, but Amelia found herself no longer completely ostracized. Invitations began to arrive again, carefully worded to include both the Duke and Duchess. Young women approached her at soirees, emboldened by her example to imagine marriages based on affection rather than arrangement. Edward's mother, the Dowager Duchess, proved more difficult. She had retreated to the family estate in Northumberland immediately after the wedding and refused all communication. Edward wrote to her weekly, patient letters describing their life in London and expressing his hope for reconciliation, but received no response. It pained him deeply, this breach with his mother, and Amelia could see the hurt in his eyes whenever another letter went unanswered. "She loved your father very much?" Amelia said one evening as they sat in the library, Edward staring at yet another unopened letter he had written. "Perhaps seeing you choose love reminds her of her own loss." "Then she should understand," Edward replied, his voice rough with emotion. "She should know better than anyone how rare it is to find what we have." "Give her time," Amelia said gently. "Grief and pride are both stubborn companions. But a mother's love is stronger than either, I think." She proved right, though it took longer than either of them hoped. It was not until autumn, a full year after their marriage, that a letter finally arrived from Northumberland. The Dowager Duchess wrote that she had spent the year in reflection and had come to certain realizations. She did not apologize, that was not her way, but she acknowledged that her son was a man grown and entitled to make his own choices. She wrote that she wished to meet Amelia properly, to judge for herself the woman who had inspired such devotion in her son. An invitation was extended for them to visit Blackthorn Hall during the Christmas season. The journey north was long and cold, the December winds bitter as they crossed into Northumberland. Blackthorn Hall emerged from the mist like something from a Gothic novel, a medieval fortress that had been expanded over centuries into a sprawling estate of towers and courtyards. It was far grander than Ravenshire House, ancient stones speaking of power that stretched back to the Norman conquest. The Dowager Duchess waited for them in the great hall, a woman in her 50s with Edward's blue eyes and an air of command that filled the cavernous space. She was dressed in grey silk, half-mourning colours that she had worn since her husband's death, and her face was as carefully composed as a mask. Amelia curtsied deeply, aware that this moment would set the tone for everything that followed. "Your Grace, thank you for receiving us." The Dowager studied her without speaking, and Amelia forced herself to meet that penetrating gaze steadily. She would not be found wanting through timidity or false modesty. Whatever judgment came, she would face it with the same honesty she had shown the Duchess of Marlborough. Finally, the older woman spoke. "You are not what I expected." "I am rarely what people expect, Your Grace." A ghost of a smile touched the Dowager's lips. "I can see that. Edward, leave us. I wish to speak with your wife privately." Edward looked as though he might protest, but Amelia gave him a small nod. This was a gauntlet she must walk alone. He bowed and withdrew, his footsteps echoing on the stone floors as he departed. The Dowager gestured toward a pair of chairs near the enormous fireplace. "Sit. We have much to discuss." For the next hour, Amelia endured an interrogation that would have done a barrister proud. The Dowager asked about her education, her beliefs, her understanding of what it meant to be a duchess. She asked pointed questions about Amelia's mother, about the circumstances of her birth, about whether she understood the responsibilities she had assumed by marrying Edward. But beneath the sharp questions, Amelia sensed something else. Not hostility, but a deep need to understand why her son had risked everything. "Tell me," the Dowager said finally, "what do you see when you look at my son?" Amelia considered the question carefully. "I see a man of great integrity, who carries the weight of his position with grace. I see someone who values justice and kindness, who works tirelessly to improve the lives of those who depend on him. I see the man I love, not the Duke of Ravenshire, but Edward, the man who reads poetry by firelight and walks the moors in the rain and believes that the world can be better than it is. And when he looks at you, he sees me," Amelia said simply. "Not my illegitimacy or my lack of fortune or my unsuitability by society's standards. He sees the person I am and chooses me anyway, every day. That is worth more than any title or any amount of wealth." The Dowager was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant. "I loved Edward's father desperately," she said at last. "He was my world. But ours was an arranged marriage, negotiated by our families when I was 16. I did not know love was possible between us until years into our marriage, and even then, it was complicated by his passions and his weaknesses. He gave me great joy and great pain in equal measure." She focused on Amelia once more. "When Edward defied convention to marry you, I saw his father's recklessness in him. I feared he was making a terrible mistake driven by infatuation rather than reason. And now? Now I see that perhaps I was wrong. The love between you and my son is not my late husband's wild passion. It is something steadier, built on genuine regard and mutual respect. You are good for Edward, I think. You ground him without diminishing him." The Dowager rose, and Amelia stood as well. "I cannot promise that I will be an easy mother-in-law. I am set in my ways and possess strong opinions, but I can promise to try, for Edward's sake, and perhaps in time, for yours as well." It was not a warm embrace of acceptance, but it was enough. Amelia felt something tight in her chest loosen. "Thank you, Your Grace, that is all I ask." The weeks at Blackthorn Hall were transformative. The Dowager proved true to her word, making efforts to include Amelia in family traditions and sharing stories of Edward's childhood. Beatrice, Edward's sister, arrived for Christmas, and though she was initially shy around Amelia, they soon discovered a shared love of music. Beatrice was 17 now, poised to make her delayed debut in the coming season, and Amelia made it her mission to ensure the girl would enter society with confidence. On Christmas Eve, The family attended services in the estate's private chapel, a stone building that had stood for 400 years. Amelia sat beside Edward, his hand warm in hers, and felt a profound sense of belonging. This was her family now, complicated and imperfect, but hers nonetheless. That night, after the household had retired, Edward led Amelia to the tower room where he had spent much of his childhood. It was filled with books and old toys, maps pinned to the walls alongside sketches of ships and distant lands. "I used to dream of escape when I was young," he said, gazing out the narrow window at the moonlit grounds. "Of sailing away to places where titles and expectations did not exist. But then I inherited the dukedom, and escape became impossible." "Do you regret it?" Amelia asked. "Do you wish you had run away when you had the chance?" He turned to her, pulling her into his arms. "Not for a moment, because if I had run, I would never have found you. And you, Amelia, are worth more than all the freedom in the world." They returned to London in January to prepare for the coming season. Amelia threw herself into the role of Duchess with determination, hosting dinners and musicales that became known for their lively conversation and eclectic guest lists. She refused to limit her circle to only those of the highest rank, inviting artists and writers and intellectuals alongside the aristocracy. Her salons became fashionable precisely because they were unpredictable. One might find oneself debating philosophy with a blue-stocking poet, or discussing the latest scientific discoveries with a university professor. Edward's political career flourished as well. He had always been active in Parliament, but now, with Amelia's support and insights, he became a voice for reform. He championed causes that other lords dismissed: education for the poor, improved conditions in factories, rights for workers. Some called him a radical, but he had learned from his marriage that sometimes the greatest courage lay in defying convention. In April, Amelia discovered she was with child. The news filled Edward with joy so profound that he could barely contain it, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around the drawing room until she laughingly begged him to stop. The pregnancy was announced publicly, and to Amelia's surprise, it seemed to soften even the hardest hearts in society. There was something about an heir to the dukedom that made their unconventional marriage suddenly more palatable to those who had condemned it. The Dowager Duchess travelled to London and took up residence at Ravenshire House, determined to ensure that her first grandchild would be born with every advantage. Her presence was sometimes overwhelming. She had opinions on everything from Amelia's diet to the decoration of the nursery, but Amelia was grateful for her company. Catherine visited as well, and though the two older women circled each other warily at first, they eventually found common ground in their shared concern for Amelia's well-being. One afternoon, Amelia found them taking tea together in the morning room, deep in conversation about baby linens. She stood in the doorway unnoticed, watching her mother and her mother-in-law, and felt tears prick her eyes. This unlikely family they had built, it was strange and imperfect, and more precious than gold. Edward noticed her emotional state and grew increasingly protective as her pregnancy advanced. He cancelled trips, rearranged his parliamentary schedule, and hovered whenever she so much as walked up a flight of stairs. Amelia found it both endearing and exasperating. "I am not made of glass," she told him, after he insisted she remain in bed for an entire day because she had mentioned feeling tired. "You are carrying my child," he replied seriously. "You are therefore the most precious thing in the world, and I will protect you whether you like it or not." Despite her protests, Amelia secretly loved his attentiveness. After a lifetime of being hidden away and treated as an inconvenience, Edward's fierce devotion was a balm to old wounds. The baby arrived on a crisp October morning, just as dawn was breaking over London. The labour was long and difficult, and there were moments when the midwife's expression grew grave. Edward paced the hallway outside their chambers, refusing to leave despite social convention dictating that husbands should absent themselves during such events. When the baby's first cry finally pierced the air, he burst into the room, propriety forgotten. Amelia lay exhausted against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat, but her face was radiant as she held their son. He was tiny and red-faced, with a surprising amount of dark hair and lungs that announced his displeasure at being born. "A son!" the midwife said, beaming. "A healthy son and heir to the dukedom." Edward knelt beside the bed, his eyes fixed on the small bundle in Amelia's arms. When he looked up at her, tears were streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for this gift, for this miracle, for everything." They named him Thomas Edward Blackthorne, after Edward's grandfather, a duke who had been known for his kindness and wisdom. Young Thomas, or Tommy as he was quickly nicknamed, was christened in the same chapel where his parents had been married, with half of society in attendance. Even those who had once condemned the marriage found it impossible to resist the charm of a ducal heir. The years that followed were the happiest of Amelia's life. She and Edward settled into a rhythm of partnership that deepened with time. They had 2 more children, a daughter, Catherine, named for Amelia's mother, and another son, William. Ravenshire House rang with children's laughter and the chaos of family life. Edward's political influence grew. He became known as the Reformer Duke, and his speeches in Parliament drew crowds. But he never forgot the lessons he had learned from his own journey, that love mattered more than lineage, that courage meant standing by one's convictions even when the world opposed them, that the rules society held sacred were sometimes in desperate need of change. Amelia found her own path as well. She established a school for girls of limited means, ensuring that young women like herself would have access to education and opportunity. She became a patron of the arts, supporting writers and painters who challenged convention, and she wrote, finally, the stories that had lived in her journals for so long, publishing them under a pseudonym that became renowned for its Gothic romances that dared to suggest women might want more from life than a good marriage. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Edward took Amelia back to Thornfield Manor, which they had maintained as a private retreat. They left the children in the capable hands of the Dowager Duchess and escaped to the moors of Derbyshire, where their story had truly begun. They stood together on the hilltop, where Edward had once promised to make his family understand, looking out over the endless expanse of heather. The wind whipped Amelia's hair around her face, and Edward pulled her back against his chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. The scandal, the ostracism, the difficulty of those early years. Amelia thought of the girl she had been, lonely and hidden, dreaming of a world she thought she could never have. She thought of the woman she had become. A duchess, yes, but more importantly, a partner, a mother, a voice for change. She thought of the love that had sustained them through every trial, the family they had built, the life they had created together. "Not for a single moment," she said, turning in his arms to kiss him. "Not one single moment." And in that kiss, on that windswept hilltop where 2 souls had first recognized each other, was the promise that had carried them through everything. The promise that love, when it was true and honest and brave enough to defy the world, could transform not just 2 lives, but the very fabric of society itself. Years later, when Amelia was an old woman with silver in her hair and grandchildren climbing on her lap, she would write in her journal one final time. She would describe the Duke of Ravenshire not as history remembered him, the reformer, the politician, the man who changed Parliament, but as she knew him, Edward, the man who had seen her when the world looked away, who had chosen love when duty demanded otherwise, who had proved that sometimes the greatest courage was not in accepting the world as it was, but in daring to change it. Their love story became legend in its own time, whispered about in drawing rooms and debated in salons. Some said the Duke had married beneath him, had weakened his family's standing through his unconventional choice, but others, the romantics, the dreamers, the young people who longed for love rather than arrangement, saw it differently. They saw 2 people who had refused to accept the limitations society placed upon them, who had fought for their right to happiness, and who had won. The children grew, carrying forward the lessons their parents had taught them. Thomas, the heir, married a baron's daughter he had courted for 3 years, refusing all his grandmother's attempts at arrangement. Catherine became a writer in her own right, publishing under her own name and scandalizing society with novels that advocated for women's rights. William entered the church and devoted himself to serving the poor, much to the Dowager Duchess's bewilderment. And through it all, Edward and Amelia remained the constants, partners, lovers, friends. They grew old together in the house that Amelia had transformed from a monument to the past into a home filled with love and laughter. They walked the moors of Derbyshire each autumn, returning to Thornfield to remember where they had begun. They held hands in Parliament's gallery as Edward gave his final speech before retirement. They danced together at their grandchildren's weddings, still moving in perfect synchronicity after decades of partnership. When Edward fell ill in his 75th year, Amelia never left his side. She read to him from the Byron volume he had given her so many years ago, the pages yellowed now, and the binding worn from countless readings. She held his hand and told him stories of their life together, reminding him of every moment of joy they had shared. "I would do it all again," he whispered to her near the end, his voice weak, but his eyes still that remarkable shade of blue. "Every scandal, every difficulty, every moment of opposition, all of it was worth it for a lifetime with you." "As would I," Amelia replied, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "You gave me the world, Edward Blackthorne. You saw me when I was invisible, loved me when I was unlovable, chose me when the world told you not to. You were my great adventure." He smiled then, the same smile that had captured her heart in a market square so many years ago. "Not I, my love. We were each other's great adventure. And what an adventure it was." He died peacefully that night with Amelia beside him and their children gathered close. The funeral was attended by half of London, for the Duke of Ravenshire had been respected and admired, despite the scandal that had marked the beginning of his marriage. But Amelia mourned him privately, in the quiet spaces they had shared, surrounded by memories of a love that had defied every expectation. She lived 5 more years, spending them at Thornfield where she felt closest to Edward's spirit. She wrote her memoirs, though they would not be published until after her death, a full accounting of their love story, holding nothing back. She wanted the world to know the truth, to understand that the greatest love stories were not the safe ones, but the brave ones, the ones that demanded sacrifice and courage and an unwavering belief in something greater than society's approval. On a grey November morning, Amelia died in her sleep. The Byron volume clutched to her chest. Her children found her with a smile on her face, and they liked to think that she had gone to join Edward, that somewhere beyond the veil they were together again, young and in love and walking the moors under an endless sky. The memoirs caused a sensation when they were published. They sparked debates about class and propriety, about the nature of love and the price of convention. Young women read them and dreamed of finding a love as profound as what Edward and Amelia had shared. Reformers cited them as evidence that society's rigid structures needed to change. Conservatives condemned them as dangerous and subversive. But in the end, none of the controversy mattered. What mattered was the story itself, a testament to the transformative power of love, to the courage required to defy convention, to the beauty of 2 souls who recognized each other across the boundaries that should have kept them apart. The Duke's forbidden love became not just a scandal but a legend, passed down through generations. And in that legend was a truth that time could not diminish, that love, when it is real and honest and brave enough to face the world's judgment, can change everything. It can transform a hidden girl into a duchess, a dutiful duke into a reformer, a scandal into a legacy that endures long after those who condemned it have been forgotten. In Derbyshire, on the windswept moors where Edward and Amelia first walked together, there stands a memorial stone. It bears no dates or titles, only a simple inscription chosen by their children. Here stood 2 souls who dared to love when the world demanded otherwise. Their courage changed not just their lives, but the very meaning of love itself. And on autumn evenings, when the mist rolls across the heather and the wind carries the scent of rain, those who walk the moors sometimes report a strange phenomenon, the sound of laughter, the glimpse of 2 figures walking hand in hand, young and in love and free at last from all the constraints that once bound them. Perhaps it is only imagination, the human need to believe that love endures beyond death. Or perhaps in some way that defies explanation, Edward and Amelia truly do walk those moors still, forever entwined, forever young, forever proving that true love, the brave, defiant, world-changing kind, never really dies at all. The end, a love that defied society, a courage that changed tradition, and a legacy that proved some rules are meant to be broken. Thank you, dear reader. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Your support inspires us to keep creating more stories of love, redemption, and breathtaking twists. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, and together we'll continue sharing tales that warm the heart. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another of our historical stories. Click and let yourself be enchanted by another unforgettable tale. With all our gratitude, echoes of romance.